You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio. Welcome to the Bitter Medicine Podcast, where it's all about Black empowerment. Our show focuses on Black news and entertainment, arts, science, economics, history, people, and strategies that uplift, empower, and motivate Africans to be in the diaspora. And now, your host, whose favorite color is black, Goku.
Welcome back to the Bitter Medicine Podcast. I am your host, Koku. Thanks for being here. I see we got some action in the chat room already. We got Reverse. Welcome back, Reverse. Haven't seen you in a couple of episodes. Reverse says he's first. Cool. He says he will hear this in order to get sleep. I don't know if that means I'm boring. But then he clarifies and says African mythologies are fascinating. So I'm glad to have Reverse inside the room. And I'm glad that you like African mythologies. I figured today I'll just do something light. It's Thursday. I always feel like Thursdays are kind of like a entertainment type of night, based on how I grew up anyway. It's an entertainment type of night. It's a night where you watch the Fresh Prince, the Cosby Show, and all that kind of stuff. So I figured I'll do something kind of fun, right? And I hope you guys enjoy. I'm gonna try to make this a short show. So let's try to do this let's just do this in about an hour or so. Before I continue, I want to remind you guys that this show is a part of a podcast network. You should check out some of the other shows on the network as well.
This is the the Partial Reality Podcast, providing you with social commentary on the news affecting our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the pro-Black perspective, where Black problems are addressed with Black solutions.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
All right, and we're back. Let's get into it. So we're reading from this book that's called, African Myths and Legends, and you see the author is Dianne, Stewart, J. Heale. And we're just gonna, start with the first story in the book. And the first story is called The Sun and Moon of the Sand People. Now, we know that African stories ground you to your African tradition, your African philosophies, your African morality, etc. And so it would be nice to see in the comment section if folks can, want to decide or determine what could the mythology be, right? That's being captured. I'm sorry. What's the moral lesson that's being captured in this myth, right? So let's go through. Hopefully Reverse doesn't fall asleep and he can give us some insight on to what he thinks some of these mythologies mean. So let's do it. So we're talking about the sun and moon of the Sand People. Long, long ago, when there were not as many people living on the southern tip of Africa as there are now, the Sand People spoke of a time when the sun was a man who lived amongst them. When the sun man lifted his arm, light streamed from his armpit, and the world basked in its warmth. But when he lowered his arm again, the world became dark and cold. One day, a childless sand woman spoke to another woman as she sat in the sun, her children playing happily around her. She says, I have been watching the sun man, and he seems to be growing old. He spends much of his time sleeping. Tell your children to gently lift up his arm when he is asleep, so that bright sunlight can shine from his armpit. Yes, added the mother of the children, it is cold without his light and warmth. And the childless woman continued, saying, tell your children to lift the sun man onto their shoulders and throw him into the sky, so that he can truly become the sun and warm us all the time. So later the sand children crept along the soft sand, leaving a trail of footprints behind them, like the spoor of an animal. They hid behind a clump of thorn bushes and waited for the sun man to lie down and sleep. The children watched as he knelt, then lay down, stretching his body out on the sand. He lifted up his arm, and rays of sunlight lit up the clumps of grass and spreading plants which grew around him. For a while it was bright and warm. Keep very still, said the eldest child. Don't let him see us. When the sun man lowered his arm, the children shivered as the cold descended on them. But after a while they heard the sound of his heavy breathing, carried to them by the gentle breeze as it danced playfully around them. He's asleep, whispered the eldest child. Creeping forward as quietly as hunters stalk their prey, the children approached the sun man. They checked that he was still asleep, then lifted his arm. They were bathed in bright light. Then, working together, sharing the weight of the load, the children lifted the sun man up onto their shoulders, and they were greatly warmed by just touching him. Remember what the old woman told us to tell him, said the youngest sand child. When the sun man became almost too hot to hold, they hurled him up towards the sky, saying, Man of the sun, become the sun in its fullness. Stay in the sky so that you will light up the land and take away the darkness. As you travel the sky, give us warmth so that the sand rice will dry and we'll be warm. As he moved upwards with his arms outstretched, bright light shone from the glaring sky. Then he became round like the sun and was no longer a man. When the sun was in the sky, it was bright, and the sand people could see one another clearly. The children found grasshoppers and flying ants. The men hunted eland, ostrich, springbok, and gemsbok, and the woman looked for food. When it was night, the sun disappeared over the horizon, taking away its light, and then the moon disappeared to lighten the darkness. The moon appeared to lighten the darkness. But the sun would chase the moon away again, and it was told to the sand children at the time that the sun stabbed the moon with its knife, so that it slowly became smaller and smaller. The moon protested to the sun. The children need just a sliver of light, so the sun agreed to allow the backbone of the moon to remain. But when the moon shrunk until it was no more than a thin sliver, it went home in great sorrow. It couldn't give much light, but then it put on a new stomach and became whole again, like a full moon. But the sand reminded their children that Mantis so disliked the dark that he threw his shoe up into the sky and it became the moon. So the new moon drifted through the night sky, feeling like the shoe of the mantis. Many moons have passed since the first time the sand told his tale to their children. And as the bright moon cast its light on them, they were reminded of the time when the moon was once also a man who could talk. He took Tortoise aside and told him that he was entrusting him with a very important message to deliver to mankind. Tell the people that as I, dying, live again, so you, dying, will live again. And as Tortoise started out early, as he knew how long it would take him to reach the people, as I, dying, live again, Tortoise repeated quietly to himself over and over again as he crossed the sand, as I living. But the more he repeated the message to himself, the more confused Tortoise became. It wasn't long before he had to admit to himself that he had forgotten the message completely. There was only one thing to do. Tortoise turned around and began retracing his tracks on the return journey to the moon. I am very disappointed in you, Tortoise, said the moon angrily. I will have to think of another plan. The moon, brushing Turtles aside, called on Heale and said, as you are a fast runner, deliver this message to the people. As I dying, live again, so you dying will live again. Heale skidded off across the sand, running as fast as he could. But he soon came on across the tender young shoots of a green plant and was distracted. He stopped, caught his breath, and began to nibble on them hungrily. Suddenly he remembered the moon's message. As I live, dying, as I dying, live. Which was it? Heale panicked. He had forgotten the moon's words, but he was too scared to go back to Moon to find out what it was. So he ran on towards the people, playing with words in his mind, arranging and rearranging them until he was convinced that he had remembered the correct message. Then the Heale said to the people, the moon says, as I dying live again, so you dying will die forever. When the moon heard that Heale had delivered the message incorrectly, he was so angry that he split Haile's lip with a stick. That is why, said the sun, the Heale has a cleft upper lip. So we go to Mantis and storytellers. Some African people explain the origin of the sun and the moon through ancient tales passed down from one generation to the next. San are known to be Africa's great storytellers, but many San stories also tell us about animals who had in a time almost forgotten once been people. Perhaps the most respected of these extraordinary creatures was the praying mantis. In San mythology, the moon is represented as the shoe of the mantis, which he threw into the sky to give him light. Mantis had as his wife Dassie, a rock rabbit. Some of these creatures may still be seen in the remarkable rock paintings left behind by the San people. San, or bushman rice, is a term for termite or ant eggs, which are considered a delicacy. So that brings us to the story of the hungry jackal. How did you guys feel about that first story? It looks like I may only have reverse in here. How did you feel about that first tale, that first mythology? All right. That brings us to the story of the hungry jackal. Let me just grab something real quick. Yeah, so that brings us to the hungry jackal. By the way, while I look this thing up on my phone here, before I continue the story, I want you guys, if you're here listening, I'd like you to click the subscribe button, hit the bell to be notified when I'm on live, and make sure to share, give us a thumbs up and make sure to share the content. Like this is story time right now, all right? We're doing some selected readings. By all means, you can share this with folks, right? You can share this with folks and let them know what we do on this channel, right? This is one of the few things. This is one of the many things that we're doing now. We're reading papers. We're discussing stories. We're reading proverbs. We're doing movie nights on the Discord. And speaking of the Discord, while I am mentioning it, let me grab the link. This link does expire in 24 hours. If you go to the call to action video that I did a few days back, you can actually use that link. That link is good for the next 100 people who want to join the Discord. I don't see no response from Reverse. I guess this black person, this African probably fell asleep on the first story. Okay, so the hungry jackal, right? A wind appeared from nowhere and set the landscape in motion. Guts swirled above the earth, gathering up the dry red dust which caked the sparsely scattered bushes and tufts of bristly grass. It carried the scent of black-backed jackal to the sheltered place where Spotted Hyena lay sleeping under a bush. By the time Hyena had come to her senses, Jackal had slinked closer and closer, carrying his tail upwards over his back. On the prowl again, Jackal asked Hyena, with a hint of curiosity in her voice. I'm always on the lookout for a good meal, laughed Jackal, scanning the horizon as he spoke. White clouds built up in the distance, and the wind chased them across the usually empty sky. Then a low bank of cloud blew towards Jackal and Hyena and seemed to hover above them in the lower reaches of the sky. There's fat, said the scavenger Jackal, dashing towards the cloud as it stretched out before him. He leaped on to the mountain of cloud and was carried across the sky by the wind. Hyena was amazed and fixed her gaze on the clouds as the wind pinned her round ears back and ruffled her tawny gray mane. All she could see was Jackal's bushy tail peering through a gap in the gray-tinged cloud. Suddenly, Jackal's satisfied face, with its long pointed ears and sharp snout, appeared over the edge of the cloud. Jackal shouted to his friend, Hyena, I've eaten all I can. I want to get off this cloud and I'm a long way from the ground. Please catch me when I jump down. Hyena said nothing. Please, Hyena, I'll share my wonderful feast with you, pleaded Jackal. There's more than enough fat up here for you too. Jump then, Jackal, I'll catch you, laughed Hyena. As Jackal fell down towards the dusty earth, and Hyena caught him, breaking his fall. When he had caught his breath, Jackal said, Right, Hyena, it's your turn now. Wait for a low cloud to pass, and then run and jump up onto it. The clouds came nearer. Hyena ran towards the horizon and jumped onto a bank of cloud. It rose up into the wind-swept sky and carried Hyena along with it. When she had eaten as much as she could, she leaned over the edge of the cloud and called down to her tawny friend, Jackal, Jackal, I want to come down. Please break my fall. Cunning, Jackal replied, Look, my friend, my hands are outstretched, ready to catch you. Down, down fell Hyena. But just as she was about to fall into Jackal's arms, he screamed, Wait, Hyena, wait. I've been pricked by a thorn. Ouch, ouch. Too late. I can't wait, cried Hyena, plunging with lightning speed towards the ground. Spotted Hyena landed with a thud. She was hurt by the fall and lay crumpled on the ground. Since that day, her left hind foot has been smaller and shorter than the right foot. In days gone by, this is the story of the Kokoi, or Hottentots, told their young children to explain why hyenas seem lame in her back legs when she first starts to walk. But they also had many, many other tales about wily Jackal that told of both his cunning and crafty ways. They tell too of how the sly Jackal tricked the foolish Hyena out of a magnificent feast. The story as told by the Kokoi is something like this. The wooden wagon was packed with glistening, gleaming fish that had been caught earlier in the day. A helper signaled to the driver of the wagon, and together they began to haul their very heavy load across the white sands that lined the blue-green waters of the Cape. The afternoon sea breeze carried the salty tang of the waves with them as they climbed the steep slope that flattened out at the top of the cliff. The scent of fresh fish caught the attention of Jackal as the wagon trundled slowly along the bumpy old road that led away from the coast. Led by his nose, he kept his distance at first, slinking along behind the wagon, unnoticed by the two men on the wagon seat. Jackal tried to think of ways of getting into the wagon from behind, but it seemed impossible to do so without being noticed. Then cunning Jackal had an idea. He ran along the side of the road, hidden by the bushes that grew along the track until he was well ahead of the wagon. Then he lay down in the middle of the road and waited. He grew restless when he couldn't hear the wheels of the wagon as they gouged their path along the road. Perhaps the wagon was stopped for the night, Jackal thought, or perhaps the drivers have decided to take another route. But after a while, Jackal heard the creaking wagon in the distance, and he lay very still. When the wagon was almost upon him, the helper shouted to the driver, "Look at that jackal lying there dead in the middle of the road. You can turn him into a fine carross for your wife." "Good idea," answered the driver. But as he was eager to continue on his journey, his helper casually flung the jackal onto the back of the wagon. As the light faded and the jackal bumped along in the back, he threw fish out onto the road, one by one, leaving a trail of shiny silverfish behind the wagon. When he had thrown out enough fish for a feast, Jackal leapt off the back of the wagon and hungrily gobbled up the fish. He tore the fresh fish and licked his lips. Jackal was so busy savoring every mouthful that he hadn't noticed Hyena slink up behind him. Hyena too was hungry and began to help herself to the fish that lay strewn across the road. Jackal watched angrily as he saw his supply of fish quickly disappear into Hyena's stomach. "Why don't you do as I did, Hyena?" said Jackal, peering at his friend. "Lie very still on the road in the path of the wagon, and you'll also be thrown onto the back as I was." Hyena took the advice and waited at the side of the road for another wagon to come by. Eventually, she'd heard the groaning and creaking of wagon wheels and lay down on the road ahead of the wagon. When he was almost upon the animal, the driver said, "What an ugly beast. Get out of the way." Taking a stick, he prodded Hyena, who was too scared to do anything but remain as still as if she were dead. Instead of being thrown onto the back of the wagon, like Jackal had said, the wagon continued on its journey without her. Hyena picked up her bruised, sore body and hobbled off to find Jackal. Jackal had already eaten his share of the fish and had given the rest to his family. "Poor Hyena, you missed out on the fish," said Jackal, pretending to feel sorry for his friend. "Perhaps we should have swapped skins." And there's a lot of jackals among us, man. There's a lot of jackals who will pretend that they're giving us, advice, right? Who pretend that they're helping us, but really they're helping themselves. Okay? Men of men. The Khoikhoi, or men of men as they call themselves, lived in the Cape of Good Hope long before the Dutch arrived and settled in the area in 1652. They were given the name Hottentots by the European settlers. Although they are similar in many ways to the Sand people, the Khoikhoi were herders of cattle, sheep, and goats, while the San were traditionally hunters and plant gatherers. It is thought that the Strandlopers, who once lived along the coast around Table Bay, now known as Cape Town, and who ate mostly shellfish and plants, might also have been part Khoikhoi. Now, and here's the thing about this writing, right? So you see, we got a story from the area, and then we got some history, and that's the kind of thing you want to see in curriculum, in the African-centered curriculum. You want the stories to reflect aspects of your tradition, aspects of your culture, not aspects, but completely your culture. I'm sorry, your community, right? And then you want to be able to hit the learner with facts about, the geography, right? The people, the land, etc. of the area. In this case, the tribes of the area. And so this is why I keep talking about curriculum, and how it takes a lot of people to really work on curriculum. One person can't really do it. I'm still waiting for some folks to provide the curriculum critique. If you're on the Discord, you'll see I also posted the considered booklets or the readings from the curriculum. I went through it, I pulled them out by grade, and I have space in there for you to put in books you think should go in those readings. And as a matter of fact, you could also say which books you think shouldn't be in the list of readings, right? But one of the things we want to make sure is that whatever they're learning in sciences or in English class or whatever is tied back, is also represented in the geography that they study, in the history that they study, right? It's all stories, and you got to relate it back to our people, right? That's how you're going to build the self-esteem of our folks, right? To continue. So we come to this story called The Milk Bird, right, by the Xhosa, right? It was spring, and the villagers came to life as though they were waking from a long winter sleep. From sunrise to sunset, the Xhosa people worked in the fields, preparing the dry ground for seeds. As they loosened the iron hard earth with hoes, they dreamed of the first spring rains that would soften the ground and bring life to their planting. Kithani had been dreaming of the rain that never came for many seasons now. The drought-stricken village in which he lived had just enough grain to see them through the winter. Still, Kithani was hopeful and worked long hours in his fields. One night while the people slept, a bird perched on top of a tree near Kithani's field and said, "Weeds grow again in Kithani's field." The weeds obeyed the bird, and when Kithani and his wife arrived at their field the next morning, they were surprised to find their land unweeded. "That's strange," said Kithani. "The land we dug up yesterday is covered over with weeds again." "We must start again," said his wife, picking up her hoe. The sun warmed their backs, and by the time they returned home with the other villagers at sunset, Kithani and his wife were stiff and tired, but satisfied that their work had been done. That night, the bird returned and gave the same order: "Weeds grow again in Kithani's field." The next morning, when Kithani and his wife saw that their land was covered with weeds again, they cried out to their neighbors in despair. "Perhaps this has happened because you are lazy," other villagers laughed. Once again, Kithani said, and his wife started uprooting the weeds and worked until sunset. When the smoke from the first fires danced above the rooftops in the village, Kithani said to his wife, "I'm going to hide near our field tonight and see who or what is destroying all our hard work. You wait for me at home." As he lay in wait, Kithani saw a bird hover above a tree and then land on one of its silhouetted branches. Such a beautiful bird that he fixed his gaze on it. The bird flew down and hopped along the ground, and Kithani was utterly amazed. Then he heard the bird say, "Weeds grow again in Kithani's field." Kithani was so angry that he ran at the bird and was about to grab it when the bird cried out, "Kithani, don't harm me. If you spare my life, I'll make milk for you." "First, you need to restore our fields," said Kithani angrily. "You have given us extra work." The bird fluttered its wings and said, "Fields of Kithani, become weeded again." And Kithani watched as the weeds became uprooted, and then ordered the bird to make milk for him. He took out a calabash, and the bird filled it with thick, warm milk. Kithani savored the milk as it slithered down his dry throat. It had been a very long time since he had tasted milk. Kithani hid the bird in his bag. When he arrived home, he said to his wife, "Wash all the largest pots we have." "What for?" "You are teasing me," said the wife. "You know that we are experiencing famine and are hungry. What food do you intend to store in the pots?" "Just follow my instructions and you will soon see," said Kathani. When the pots were clean, Kathani gathered his sleepy children around the pots and told them to watch. He took out the bird and said, Bird, make sour milk for my thirsty family. The children watched in awe as the beautiful bird made sour milk for them, filling all the pots. Just remember, children, said Kathani, tell no one about this bird, not even your best friends. The next day, happily fed, Kathani and his wife continued to cultivate their fields. It would soon be time to plant maize, beans, and pumpkins. One day when the children of the village were playing near Kathani's house, Little Namsa said, Children of Kathani, why is it that you are fat and we are so thin? Kathani's children looked at each other and said, But we are no fatter than you are. But the children of the village did not believe them and kept nagging Kathani's children to tell them their secret. Eventually, Kathani's young daughter whispered, There is a special bird in our father's house that makes thick milk for us. Can we see it? The children asked in disbelief. Checking that their parents were still working in the fields, Kathani's children led their inquisitive friends into the quiet house. Where is it? Asked one of the children, looking around curiously. Kathani's daughter took the beautiful bird from the secret place where it was hidden and asked it to make milk for all the children. Obediently, the bird did as it was asked, and after drinking the sour milk, the children said, Let the bird free for a little while, so that it can fly around and stretch its wings. It is such a beautiful bird. Suddenly the bird flew out of the house and, stretching its wings, soared high into the cloudy sky. Our father will be very angry, cried Kathani's eldest child. We must follow the bird quickly. All day long, the children chased the bird, not even stopping when they had a stitch in their side. The bird rested on the ground. They grabbed to it, but it took off again, landing in trees, always out of the children's reach. As the sun neared the hills in the west, the villagers left their fields and returned to their homes. Kathani looked at the gray clouds and said to his wife, We are sure to have rain tonight. Look at those mountains of clouds. But where are the children? They normally run to greet us. They searched the house and yard frantically, and when Kathani saw that the bird was missing too, he knew what must have happened. The setting sun was darkened by heavy clouds, and the light disappeared quickly. The village children were a long way from home and feared a storm. Let us forget about the bird and return to our parents. Listen to the thunder roaring in the distance. Do not be afraid, said one of the older boys. I will look after you. So the boy made a shelter for all the children, and they gathered wild roots and toasted them on a fire. As they were eating, a cruel old man mysteriously appeared from the shadows and demanded their food. They were terrified. Give him the roots, said the elder boy. While the man gobbled up the food, the children escaped, running as fast as a buck. But when they turned around, they saw that he was following them. Let's hide in that forest, said the boy, leading them to a dark forest at the foot of a mountain. You'll be safe here, he assured them. Climb that tree and stay there. So the children sat shivering in the dark, clutching the branches of the tree. After a while, the children saw a bird with the largest wingspan they had ever seen. It appeared out of the darkness and hovered over them. Cling to me, said the eagle. I will take you home. Flying through the darkness of the cool night, the bird took the first children home. Then he returned again, trailing the sky with his kiwi until all the children were safely home. Kathani and the other parents were so relieved. Where have you been? They asked. We thought you would be angry when the bird escaped, so we chased it, cried the eldest child. I am so relieved that you are safe, said the mother. The milk bird never returned, but Kathani, ever hopeful, said, we are sure to have rain soon, so that our crops will grow and flourish. And as he said this, first drops of rain hit the dry, iron-hard earth. And so we reached this section that talks about milk of Africa. Amasi, or maas, is a thick, naturally soured milk rather like yogurt, enjoyed by many Southern African people. So again, if while I was reading it, you were wondering, well, why are you drinking sour milk? Right? It's a drink that has been soured, right? And it's almost like a yogurt, apparently, enjoyed by many Southern African people. This curdled milk, like most dairy products, is not only very nourishing and healthy, but is also quite cheap and forms the basis of many traditional tribal dishes. Amasi may be mixed with vegetables and is also used to make cottage cheese. Because it is so popular and is part of the staple diet of many people, amasi can now also be bought in shops. Right? So again, this is how you want like stories, right? In your curriculum. You want the story and you want the actual background, right? To give it context, right? And that context is what's going to drive it home for the learner. If you want our children to be more African-centered, you got to give them African-centered stories, and then drive the points home with context, you know, of where these stories are said to be taking place. For example, in the chat room, I see Reverse has awakened from his nap, and he says this is what Amos Wilson said, that it is their view of seeing Africa and not ours. That was earlier, and then more recently, I guess when I was reading this story here about the Zosha, Reverse says, like fermented milk. Yeah, it's like some kind of fermented milk or something curdled anyway. I don't know if they put lime in it or whatever to curdle it, right? But it's like a yogurt, right? And by the way, if you're a yogurt person, you can make yogurt and what's this thing they mentioned? It's cottage cheese easily at home with a mason jar. Mason jar and milk at room temperature, or even at refrigerator temperature. You shake it every day. You put it in a jar, you seal it, you shake it every day, and you come back to it every day and you shake it. It would take on a solid form. That is the same consistency of cottage cheese. Right? There's ways that we can do things to make our life simpler and grounded, and we choose not to do a lot of it. Right? But these are the things that we need to be looking at. We need to be reading these types of stories, especially for the younger learners. Reading these types of stories, and then in their history classes, driving it home about the peoples in these regions that the stories are talking about. And then taking the time to decipher, well, what is the moral in the story here? Now, while I was reading that story in the early parts, it took me back to the movie that I showed in the Discord. If you weren't there, and by the way, I posted the link in the chat room. Click the link and join the Discord today. All right. But one of the things I did on Saturday, I showed this film, this Netflix film, that had some buzz about a year ago, about 2 years ago maybe, right? The boy who harnessed the wind, and it's about a Malawian kid who, their people were generations of farmers, but they go through, you know, parts of the continent goes through this drought where there's no rain. So as farmers, you're asked out, and eventually your storages will run out. And this kid took a habit of going and reading certain books in the library. And as I posted on Twitter recently, you could go on Twitter and see where I posted it. The kid was using, this kid William was using this book, an American book called, I think it's called Using Energy. If you go to look up that book right now, it's behind a $300 or $400 paywall right now. And I believe a part of that is because of the movie that came out in 2019. You understand? And what this kid did, he used this book, Using Energy, I think that's the name of the title of the book. And he learned on how to create energy, how to create electricity. He's from a village that had none. The closest thing they had to electricity was one of his teachers had a bike that had a dynamo on it. You guys should know what a dynamo is, right? Had a dynamo on it, so as the teacher rode the bike, the dynamo spun and created electricity that powered the front light on the bike. This kid found a solution for the African problem. He created a wind turbine or windmill. Right? He created a wind turbine or windmill, attached it to an old water pump, and was able to pull water out of this deep well, right? And was able to water crops and save the village. Side note, his story when it hit the internet some years ago, like in early 2000s, right? These guys from one of these schools in America had grabbed him up. We should have been grabbing him up ourselves. You see? So these stories, right, not only can serve to instill some connection to their African origins, but also grounds them in being self-determined Africans as well, right? You can be a part of curating these type of stories in our curriculum. The link is in the chat room. Join the Discord and let's get to work. Who doesn't like reading a good story? I'm mad there's not more people in here right now, but that's fine. But who doesn't like a good story? You can play this for your children, right? Like Reverse said, he's gonna go to sleep listening to this. Again, I don't know how to take that exactly, right? It's all good though. At least Reverse is here with you, boy. All right. So we're going to the frog's first croak, and you'll notice under these stories there's an African tribe, right, or a set of African peoples mentioned, right? So this is a Zulu story now. We have Xhosa, we have Zulu, we have the Khoi, etc. Right? This takes us different parts of Africa. So in geography class, after you've read this story, you're supposed to be learning, well, where did the Zulu tribes, reside? Where in Africa will you find the Zulu? We know Zulu are in South Africa, but I think they're in other parts of Africa too. This is how you're supposed to set up your learning experience for the early learner. All right? This is how you should do it. Yeah. So, frog's first croak. Dawn brought the first gentle light to the scraggy, drought-ravaged Thornveld. Slowly the sun began its climb into the orange-tinged sky and gathered its strength for the long journey to the west. Animals began to emerge from the silent shadows. Warthog and her young crept out of the aardvark hole where they had sheltered for the night. Noisily, they scrunched their way through the dry undergrowth, heading towards the water. They were not the first to arrive at the shallow waterhole. A herd of graceful tan and white impala who were quietly drinking fled in the fright as Warthog stalked her solitary claim to the muddy shallows of the drinking place. Frog watched her from a log at the edge of the murky water. She and her young rolled and snorted with delight as the mud caked their hairy bodies. She really does take over the waterhole, grumbled Frog to himself. But not for long. Soon Warthog was joined by zebra, giraffe, and a herd of Nyala. When she discovered she was not alone, Warthog left the muddy water and scratched her itchy back against a tree. Her young waited impatiently nearby. Suddenly there was a hush amongst the animals at the water's edge. They had heard a cry and listened keenly as the cry became closer and closer. "It's a side-striped jackal himself," said one of the zebra. "I wonder what he is doing up so early." At the sight of the trickster, the animals around the waterhole became uneasy. Jackal spoke immediately. "There seems to be very little honey about," he said. "Yes," agreed Nyala Bull, tossing his head back. "I've noticed." Nyala was especially fond of honey. In fact, all the animals had noticed that honey was scarce. They all liked it very much, and suddenly everybody had something to say about the shortage. "I say," said the jackal, screaming to make his voice heard above the drone of discussion, "that whoever finds honey should be allowed to eat it." "Agreed," said Nyala Bull, "as long as the animal who finds it can get past the bees who are guarding the honey. When the bees have honey, they're as vicious as a wild dog with a bone. I've been stung many, many times." "That is always a problem," laughed Zebra, lifting her head from the fold she was gently grooming. "I think all the honey that is found should be shared among us all. After all, we are all partial to the fruit of the bees." I like that term, fruit of the bees. The animals agreed. "I have an idea," said Giraffe, straightening his legs after taking a long drink of cool water. "I have been listening to the discussion, and I think it would be a good idea to take the matter to Elephant. He is the largest and wisest of us all, and he'll be able to help us decide how we are going to share the small amount of honey that is left in the thorn veldt." "Yes," said Nyala. "Elephant's many years in the bush have given him great experience and wisdom. Why not leave the matter to me? I'll decide who will have the honey and who won't," offered the wily side-striped jackal. But no one trusted Jackal. By the time the animals had set off to find Elephant, the sun was almost a quarter of the way on its journey through the sky. It shone down brightly, warming the already dry and dusty earth. Old Elephant Bull, who lived alone, was wallowing in the slow-flowing waters of the river when the deputation arrived. He seemed to ignore them as they waited for him on the riverbank. He squirted himself slowly with cool brown water as the animals continued to squabble amongst themselves on the bank above it. After a long wait, Black Rhino stood apart from the animals and put himself in charge of the deputation. "Elephant, we need you to settle an argument that has broken out over the shortage of honey this year." Elephant flapped his ears, then he spoke. "I know." Elephant knew everything. "I've been listening to the argument, and I think the best way to settle the dispute is to declare that because there is so little honey, none of the small animals should be allowed to eat any honey at all." "Not a bad idea," said Black Rhino. "After all, they do have very small appetites, unlike us larger animals." Gray duiker, mongoose, sunni, spotted hyena, and even muddy warthog were not at all pleased with the new ruling. "We have been discriminated against because of our size," said Sunni. Frog had arrived just in time to hear the judgment, and he too was very unhappy with the ruling. Small animals murmured and grumbled among themselves, but were too afraid to speak out against Elephant's decree. But Frog, who had been stunned into silence, could simply not keep quiet any longer. He enjoyed fresh dripping honey as much as any other animal, and never before had he been told that he could not eat honey. Why should only the large animals be allowed to eat honey? That is terribly unfair. Frog spoke in a deep, melodious voice and surprised even himself that he had been so outspoken. "Frog is right," chorused the small animals. His boldness had given them courage. "Silence," thundered Elephant, flapping his huge ears in anger. "Who dares challenge my ruling?" Tortoise suddenly endowed with enormous courage, stuck out his neck and begged Elephant for the chance to say something. Kind Elephant said, "Tortoise, don't you think that it would be fairer if none of the animals ate any honey for a whole year? Maybe then the bees would have made enough for us all to enjoy." The animals couldn't believe that Tortoise had dared to make a suggestion to Elephant. A debate followed, interrupted only by the sound of Lion's yawn in the distance. A hush fell over the animals. Frog, knowing that he had the support of the small animals and angry because he was denied his rights because of his size, burst out, "Excuse me, Elephant, but I cannot live without honey for such a long time. And there are many animals here who would agree with me." "Please be quiet, Frog," whispered Sunni. "You're spoiling it for the rest of us." Then in a loud voice, Elephant replied, "I need time to reconsider the matter." He realized that his wisdom should be just and fair for all. So the animals waited restlessly on the riverbank, while Elephant pondered the matter of the honey. Finally, Elephant said, "We have an agreement. No one may eat honey for a whole year. Anyone found breaking the law will be punished." By the time the agreement was reached, the sun had already moved on, leaving a trail of scorching heat, which sent the animals clambering back into the thornveld in search of shade. The hot days crept by, and poor Frog began to regret that he had spoken out so boldly. More than anyone else in Thornveld, Frog craved honey, and when the honey guide fluttered his wings and flew around in circles, drawing attention to a hive, Frog found it very hard to ignore him. The bird's distinctive chattering cry was a great temptation to a honey lover. One day when Frog was out searching for food, he saw a swarm of bees foraging for pollen and nectar. Making sure that no one was around, Frog traced the path of the bees back to their hive in the hollow of a dead tree, not far away from from the reeds where he lived. While planning a way to get at the honey without being stung, he suddenly remembered Elephant's warning. Reluctantly, Frog turned back. He resisted the temptation to steal the honey and tried to forget all about the sweet, drippy substance he so loved. But one day early in spring, he noticed a huge swarm of bees leaving the hollow tree. "They're looking for a new hive," he thought. So late that afternoon, as the setting sun cast its finger-like shadows on the thornveld, Frog went out to find a little taste of honey. The sun was disappearing quickly, taking most of the light with it. "No one would mind if I had a taste," he reassured himself. "In fact, no one would even see me," he thought. Frog looked around in all directions. There was no one around. Checked again. He checked again and then hopped towards a tree. He was pleased to see that there were fewer bees guarding the honey than before. In the tree were glistening pieces of honeycomb, dripping with dark golden honey. His mouth watered. He leaped forward towards the comb with great courage. His heart pounded in his chest. He helped himself to a mouthful of honey. "Delicious," he said, as the sweetness clung to the inside of his mouth, even after he had swallowed it. When Frog had finished, he looked longingly at the comb again, wishing that he could have a little more, but he decided against it. He couldn't take the chance. He was already feeling a little guilty. As he left home, still savoring the taste of honey in his mouth, Frog heard a voice in one of the trees above him. He hopped more quickly, trying to hide in the wheat-colored grass. He heard the voice again. It seemed to be following him. He froze. Frog was beginning to feel very frightened, and indeed his eyes stuck out even more than usual. Someone must have seen him. Frog felt so guilty about what he had done, he could barely speak. "I'm sorry," he croaked. "I'm so sorry," he replied to the voice above him, in a deep voice that sounded like a bellowing young calf. Frog was so choked up that he had great difficulty forming the sounds of the words in his throat. Not only had he eaten the honey, but someone had seen him do it. He had also betrayed the trust of all the animals in the Thornville. He never did discover who the voice belonged to, but Frog had learned his lesson. From that day on, Frog's eyes always looked as if they were about to pop out of his head. And even today, Bullfrog always croaks in a loud, booming voice and never eats honey. Right? So, like, I mean, there's so much lessons in this story. By the way, the curriculum that some of us have critiqued, and I'm waiting for others to finish their critique. The curriculum that we critiqued, you know, in the early grades, grade 1, 2, 3, they don't really deal with science and stuff too much. They say, you know, and by the way, this is one of spoilers. This is one of my critiques of that curriculum. Very vague. Right? But they say stuff like take the children to the zoo and stuff like that, which is all good. But if you like look at this story, how many animals were discussed in this story? All of those animals could then become a part of what you're going to discuss in science. Right? The learner could then write mini papers on these different animals. Right? Tracing their classification, right? Are they birds, are they insects, are they mammals, etc., right? Tracing their classification and writing stories about features of these animals, what they eat, you know, what kind of habitat they like to live in, right? And this is how you can reinforce some of that early science, the observation. Then when you take them to the zoo, that's where they will actually observe these animals and see if what they learned about, what they wrote about, holds true. This is why it is said it takes a village. One person can't do all that work. If one person does the work, you know what happens? Then you get a vague African-centered curriculum. So for those of you who have read the curriculum that I'm talking about, you'll understand where I'm coming from. That resulting curriculum, and I don't want to cast any aspersions on the brother who put it together, but it's vague, and it's vague because I suspect he primarily, I think it's a guy, yeah, it's a guy, he primarily wrote that curriculum. You don't want that. And I'm not giving the name of the curriculum or the school. Again, I'm not trying to cast any aspersions on those folks. You want a curriculum, and similarly, you want a teacher, right, who is one and the same with curriculum, has the same understanding that the curriculum is trying to give to the learner. Okay? But this is why we need people. We need folks who will take this hard job of reading African mythology, African myth stories and stuff like that, and turning it into, you know, parts of a curriculum. This story is an example of that. How many animals did we talk about in this story? The explanation of this story, I see we got Achieve Mindset in the room. Achieve Mindset, thanks for coming through. I'm not going to be on here much longer because I'm trying to do shows that are, you know, more digestible, you know, an hour, maybe an hour and a half, as opposed to 2 or 3 hours, right? But thanks for coming through anyway. You guys make sure give me a thumbs up on the video. I know most of you have subscribed already. And click the bell if you haven't to be notified when I'm on. This way you can be here at the start of the show, right? But I appreciate you coming through anyway, right? Respect to you. So there's this explanation, the flight of the honeybee. A bee colony can consist of 6,000 bees, all busily contributing to the tiny community within a hive. There are 3 types of bee in the hive, and each has special duties. The queen bee is the mother of the colony and lays the eggs. She is cared for by the infertile females called workers, who feed the larvae and clean and protect the hive. When a hive is disturbed, the workers will protect it fiercely, and an angry swarm can be quite dangerous. Male bees are called drones, but only one drone mates with the queen. And we talk about nation building, right? I mean, this is how this nation, this bee nation, works. And again, you could tie, even for the young learners, right? You could take these stories and tie it to other subject areas. While they, become better readers, better writers, right? We just mentioned a number of 60,000. You could use that in mathematics. They could work on their division. They could work on multiplication based around the number of bees that can be in a colony. You see? And this is what you call, what I'm describing as an integrated curriculum. What this will do, this will give the early learners understanding. This will give them a foundation. As you go up higher in grades, the readings will be different. The readings will be centered towards problems and how do you solve them. Pythagoras theorem in math, okay, how do I use that practically? In bridge building, for example, in erecting houses or roofs or what have you, right? This is why we need hands on deck, right? Again, the link is in the description. I'm gonna take a quick station ID break here. When I come back, I'll read another story or two, and then we'll call it a wrap for tonight, all right? So stick around. Right now, we're doing a station ID.
This is Dianne. You tuned to the Harsh Reality Podcast, providing you with social commentary on the news affecting our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the pro-black perspective, where black problems are addressed with black solutions.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
And we're back. Let's read two more stories. Right? Achieve Mindset just got here. Let Achieve hear two more stories from us. All right? So, the next story is the Cattle Herder's Song. And this comes out of Swaziland. Right? Again, beautiful. Right there, in geography, let's talk about the Swazi people. From Swaziland. Let's talk about the customs, the rituals. Let's talk about the language. Right? Let's do things like, in language class, let's learn how to do like simple greetings. Learn the days of the week in Swaziland. Things of that nature. That's what I'm talking about. So the Cattle Herder's Song, Swazi. In a fertile valley west of the Lubombo Mountains lived a king who had a large herd of fine cattle. In fact, it was one of the largest herds in Swaziland. The king valued his beasts so highly that only his son was allowed to take care of them. Early every morning, the boy would take his father's cattle out to graze. At night, he would call each by name and herd them home to the corral. On dreamy summer days, the boy would open the corral gate and drive the cattle to the river. They were led by a magnificent ox with fine horns and a loud voice. So when he bellowed, all the cattle followed. The boy would sit on the rocks at the edge of the river and watch the weavers build their nests and the swallows swoop down to drink. Sometimes he would sit in the cool shadows of the rocks where moss and little ferns grew. But as much as he loved his father's cattle, the king's son often grew tired and longed to sleep, especially at midday when the sun's heat is greatest. But he forced himself to stay awake so he could watch the animals as they graze in the long grass. One summer day, as he lay on a rock with the heat waves rising up around him, the boy fell asleep and thought he was dreaming. A gnarled old woman stood beside him. He sat up in fright. "Don't be afraid," said the woman. "I'm here to help." "It is such a responsibility to look after my father's animals," the boy said. "They are so important to him that if one cow strays or is stolen, I'll be in great trouble. I have to wake early in the morning. I often get so tired out here in the heat of the sun." The old woman smiled, looked at the large, round rock worn smooth by the river. The boy looked at the rock and was sure he had never seen it before. The woman continued, "It is so wet and slippery that anyone who tries to climb it will fall into the river. But you shall not fall. That will be your rock. Stand on it, and you'll be able to see the whole river valley. You'll be able to follow the course of the river as it slithers around the bend like a snake, and you'll see all your father's cattle in one glance." The boy was so excited that he ran towards the large, smooth rock. "Wait, son," the old woman warned. "Never fall asleep on that rock, or your cattle will be stolen. I will teach you a special song, and when the cattle hear it, they will all come to you and follow you wherever you wish to lead them." The boy listened as the wind whipped up the grass around him, and the river flowed by lapping at its edges. Then the old woman sang her simple song: "Cattle, cattle far away, come to me and do not stray." The boy practiced it. When he had mastered the tune, he saw his animals ambling towards him from all directions. He turned around to thank the old woman for her kindness, but she was gone. All through the summer, the boy sang to the cattle, and they never strayed or were stolen. One day, the air in the valley was so hot and humid that the king's son lay down on his special rock to rest. It was a quiet day, with no wind to rustle the sweet reed on the other side of the riverbank and cool his face. He fell asleep. The people on the hillsides noticed that the herder was asleep and slowly cried down into the river valley. They gathered all the cattle together and drove them away, led by the magnificent oxen. When the king's son awoke, refreshed by his sleep, he stood up on his rock, stretched, and looked for his cattle. They were gone. In desperation, he sang his special song as loudly as he could: "Cattle, cattle far away, come to me and do not stray." But there was no response, not even an echo. Panic-stricken, he ran up and down the riverbank, thinking that the cattle might have strayed, but by nightfall, he had still not found them. He dreaded going home. When he arrived home and told his father that his cattle had gone, the king was so angry that he said, "Go and search for my prized possessions. You're not welcome here until you return with my cattle." The boy wandered down to a stone at the river's edge. With the dim light of the half moon, he climbed up onto the slippery rock and cried. Suddenly he felt a hand on his shoulder. "I told you not to sleep," said the old woman. "Now your cattle have been stolen. But go to the chief who has your cattle and ask him to take you on as his herder." At first light, the young boy walked along the mountain path through many cultivated fields, and at last he reached the settlement of the chief. He heard the bellowing of the ox and knew immediately that his father's cattle were in the chief's corral. He begged the chief to let him watch the cattle. The chief agreed, so the boy worked for many years, thinking of a way to return his father's cattle. In the mornings when he took the animals out to graze, and in the evenings when he returned home with them, the boy sang his special song. Although he longed to be with his own family, he was comforted not by the fact that he was with his father's cattle. One year, at the time of the first fruits festival, the king's son saw that beer had been prepared by the women and had been placed in a row of calabashes outside the kraal. All the men, women, and children had gone to the fields with their baskets to gather the first ripe produce of the harvest: maize, millet, groundnuts, sugarcane, and pumpkins. Only the king's son and an old woman who was way too old to do any work were left at home. The boy had a plan. He ground a special herb into a fine powder and put a little of it into each calabash. This would make the drinker sleep. The celebrations began, and the first fruits of the harvest were brought to the chief. His advisors gave him and all present a purification drink of seawater and river water, mixing them with herbs. Then, while the king's son watched from afar, they ate the first fruit and drank beer. Not one was awake to see the full moon rising, except for the cattle herder, who had not taken part in the celebration. He crept off to the cattle kraal and, opening the gate, sang, "Cattle, cattle, far away, come to me, and do not stray." The boy led his cattle past the sleeping villagers. The sound of their snoring drowned the clump of the cattle's hooves, and no one stirred. By the light of the full moon, the king's son escaped with his father's cattle. Clumsily, they made their way across the countryside. At sunrise, the ox in front bellowed so loudly that all the cattle from the east, west, and south came to join them. With a sense of urgency, the boy drove the cattle toward his father's kraal, only allowing them to graze or drink at the river for a short time. But when the chief woke to find his cattle missing, he called his warriors together, and with their shields and asseges, they followed the tracks of the cattle. Towards evening, the king's son heard the chief's men in the distance behind him. He drove the cattle down from the hills into a thickly wooded area that lined the stream. The boy hid beneath a fig tree. He was very scared and didn't want to lose his cattle again. Darkness fell. He was cold and lonely. He knew that he had to think of a plan before dawn. At first light, the chief's men would start following him again. The mosquitoes irritated him. The frogs around him croaked so loudly that he couldn't sleep, and bats scuffled in the branches above him. Suddenly he heard a voice. It was a voice he recognized. "Do not be afraid," said the old woman. "Just do as I tell you. Kill one of your white oxen and make 10,000 little shields out of the hide. I will bring you warriors of your own." The boy looked at the woman in disbelief, but he did exactly as he was told. Then the old woman turned to the frogs and said, "Each one of you must take up a shield and be a warrior for the king's son." All through the night, the boy instructed them, and just before the darkness of the night gave way to the gentle rays of the morning sun, the boy ordered his army of frogs to sit in a row in the hillside, so that the chief's men would clearly see. I think they meant sit in a row on the hillside, so that the chief's men would clearly see the warriors and their shields. When the chief and his men saw the great army of frogs and heard their war cries, they were terrified and retreated into the valleys. Although the chief was desperate to retrieve his cattle, he decided that he would rather lose the cattle than his men. So after the cattle had grazed on the sweet grass, the king's son sang his song and continued his journey to his village. The cattle followed contentedly. The king was overjoyed to see his son. He hugged him and gave him great honor. "You have looked after my cattle well, son," he said proudly, "and they have increased in number." So every morning and every evening, the king's son sang his special song, and the cattle neither strayed nor were stolen. And now they tell us about the festival of fruits that we just read. The annual First Fruits Festival is still celebrated in Swaziland today in gratitude for the harvest. The celebration starts 3 weeks before the summer solstice with a ceremony called Little Inkwala. A group of men go off to the west to collect river water, while another group journeys to the east to find seawater. On their return, the king and his attendants withdraw into a secluded hut called the Lambelo, where the king tastes the first fruits of the season and the traditional sweet reed. When the dancing and singing begins, the people know that they can eat the harvest. The big Inkwala takes place at full moon, less than 2 weeks later, and lasts for 6 days. There's dancing and sacred songs are sung. The young men of the village cut branches from the sequoia thorn tree to reinforce the king's hut, and a black bull is killed. The ceremony then ends with a huge bonfire in which the remains of the slaughtered bull, a section of the crops, and items used by the king in his Lambelo are burnt. Right? Is anyone still listening to this live stream? If you're listening to the live stream, or even if you listen to the playback, how do you feel about these stories? And how do you feel about what I've been talking about in terms of using these stories in lower grades of curriculum and connecting them to other topics or areas of study for the young learners? We already see where we could tie these stories to geography. We can tie these stories to history. We could tie these stories to language, right? How cool would it be for your child to have an education where not only are you learning about stories of, say, the Swazi people, or the Xhosa, right, or the Zulu, right? Not only are you learning about stories from those parts and those peoples of Africa, but you're also learning about their customs, right? You're also learning about, some of their language, right? This is what we need to be doing. In the chat room, Achieve Mindset says he's still listening. And then he says they should be connected to other topics for a bigger picture. And then he says linking it to the fruits of the festival is good. He goes on to Achieve Mindset, I think is a guy, correct me if I'm wrong. He goes on to say it's good for teaching about health. Yeah, that's the other thing. Yeah, right. Now you just reminded me of something else I wanted to mention. Thank you, brother, for saying that. Right? There is a study, as you mentioned, health. There was a study conducted that showed that Black people, right, people outside of the continent, right, Africans outside of the continent, they did a study that shows that Black folks do better when they eat an African diet, right? The brother X Spots the Mark on Twitter posted his article in a tweet, and his tweet says Black people everywhere should eat more African food because Africans have the lowest rates of obesity and other diet-related ailments on the planet. Studies have shown Black people in the diaspora get a lot of health benefits from eating African foods. And as we read in that story about the festival, right? That reminds me, and Achieve Mindset is the one who really reminded me, we need to talk to young kids about an African-centered diet. and get them early on. So a story like this, and I'm sure there's others that get a little bit more into diet, right? I mean, so far we've read about the yogurt that certain groups drink, the sour milk, right? We also got to teach about that African diet, because the American diet that most of us engage in is killing us for sure, right? It's the African diet that we need to embrace. Achieve Mindset goes on to say, the boy had an army, which is good for understanding discipline and preparation. And the boy also had an elder. And shout out to Achieve Mindset for being here and participating in this discussion. The boy also had an elder that he listened to. Notice he didn't really question what the elder said. And in fact, the elder could have been a spirit of some kind, an ancestor, right? Which is why he didn't question what the ancestor had to say. All of that could be taught in an African-centered education. If you started off with these types of stories, you can connect specific stories to specific learning modules in other subject matter, in other subject areas. I'm going to read one more story, and then we'll call that a night, okay? Read one more story, we'll call that a night. This story is called Hen and Hawk's Lost Friendship, and this is from the Sotho people. Long ago, in the mountain kingdom of Lesotho, a special friendship developed between Hawk, a bird of the air, and Hen, a bird of the earth. Hawk loved to visit Hen. Whenever he came down to earth to talk to Hen, she would stop whatever she was doing, flap her little rust-red wings, and cackle as she listened to Hawk. They were very good friends. Now, Hawk had a treasured possession that no other bird in the kingdom owned. It was a shiny silver needle, and he kept it carefully hidden in his home high up on the mountain ridge. Hen knew about this needle, and one day when Hawk was visiting her, she asked, "Dear Hawk, please may I borrow your needle?" "Whatever do you want to do with my needle?" asked Hawk in astonishment. "I'd like to sew a new blanket for myself. The summer is nearly over, and it gets so cold when the snow covers the mountains." "Dear Hen," said Hawk, you know it is the only needle amongst all the birds. What will happen if you lose it?" "I promise I won't, Hawk," pleaded Hen. "I'll only use it myself and take very special care of it. If I lose your precious needle, you can have something precious of mine." "And what is that?" Hawk asked. Hen paused for a moment and thought about what was dearest to her in all the kingdom. And knowing that she would certainly guard Hawk's needle with her life, offered him one of her most treasured possessions, a chick. Hen answered confidently, "One of my precious little children." "Fine," agreed Hawk. "That was a fair exchange. Your young chicks must surely be as special to you as my needle is to me. So I know you will look after it well." Hawk took off into the clear blue sky, and with his strong wings, Hawk took off into the clear blue sky with his strong wings, and Hen watched until he was but a little black dot in the distance. Then she gathered together her little skins and laid them out, ready to start patching them together to make her blanket. She was so happy to think that she would soon have a lassie, a magnificent skin blanket fit for a chief or one of his wives. When she looked up into the sky again, Hen saw Hawk already, making his way back to her from his mountaintop home. In his strong, hooked beak, he carried his gleaming needle. With a promise to take good care of it, Hen took the needle and Hawk flew off in search of breakfast. Hen threaded the needle with a long thread, and using fine stitches, she carefully sewed her skin blanket. When it was finally finished, she wrapped it around her and showed it to her family. "You look more beautiful than any other hen on earth," said her family. This pleased Hen and made her feel very proud. She walked up and down, showing off her new blanket. She felt like a very special person, as grand as the wife of a chief in her new lawsuit, and was so flattered when fowls that she didn't even know came up to her and said, "Hen, you look very beautiful, just like the chief's wife." But all the hens in the village had seen her blanket, Hen quickly called together all her chicks and said, "I do not want my new blanket to get dirty. Please clean the house for me. Gather the dirt together and put it all on the fire's heap so that it is ready to be burnt." When Hen went strutting off to show her new blanket to the hens who were working in the fields, so proud was she. She even forgot all about Hawk's needle. Hen's little chickens cleaned her straw house from top to bottom, swept the floor, and threw all the dust onto the fire heap as they had been told to do. "Mother will be pleased with us," they chirped. "There is not a speck of dust anywhere." But Hawk's precious needle was hidden amongst the dirt. The hens weeding the fields admired Hen in her new blanket. "You look so radiant, Hen, as beautiful as one of the chief's wives," they remarked. All the compliments had gone to Hen's head, and she strutted home proudly, forgetting the words of her forefathers who said, "Pride comes for the fall." That's something I learned over and over as a kid. Pride comes before a fall. Suddenly, as Hen was following the little path through the grass that led to her home, she saw a large, dark shadow on the ground. In front of her, she recognized her dear friend, Hawk, but she had forgotten all about his needle and the promise she had made to him. Swooping down to the ground, Hawk said, "Hen, do you realize how proud you have become in that smart blanket of yours?" She giggled and, taking no notice of him, kept on walking along the path. Then Hawk said to his friend, "I have come for my needle so I can put it back in its very special place." Hen jumped. She got such a fright. She suddenly remembered the promise she had made to Hawk and the price she would have to pay if she lost his precious needle. She didn't say a word but hurried back to her little house. When she arrived home, she saw that the floor was spotlessly clean. There was not even a speck of dirt on the floor. There was no needle either. She looked everywhere for it. "It must be on the fire heap," she said, running outside. She ran as fast as she could to the edge of the village where the fire heap was still smoldering. Hawk hovered above Hen, watching her as she searched through the fire heap, desperate to find the missing needle. Hen could see the worry on Hawk's penetrating eyes. She scratched and scratched, frantically looking for the lost treasure. She didn't even notice that her blanket had fallen off her back and it lay in the ashes on the fire heap. Hawk flew off to give her a little time, but when he swooped down again from the sky, Hen knew he had come to take her chick. She moaned and groaned in anguish. She ran to protect her children, rocking them safely under her wing. But Hawk was not an unreasonable friend, and he flew off again so that Hen could scratch around in the dirt a little longer. When he had disappeared, the chicks went back to scratching for food. Hen clucked and cackled and was a little relieved, but she was still worried. Not long ago, she had felt like the wife of a chief, but now she was nothing. She didn't even know where her new Halossi was. And she felt like a mother who could not even protect her own young. "I have to find Hawk's needle. I must find it," she cried out aloud. The hens in the village were worried about her. She looked so distressed. Hen told them what had happened, and they felt very, very sorry for her. They were mothers too and understood how she felt. So they helped her look for Hawk's needle. They looked in the long grass. They looked along the dirt paths. They even looked through the fire heap again. No one could find the needle. Then as Hawk flew over them, he cast a sprawling dark shadow across the paths of the hens, and they shrieked in terror. They were very frightened. There was no guarantee that Hawk would not take one of their children. "Chicks, come quickly and hide under our wings," they cried to their children. They never found the needle. No, never. It was lost forever. Hawk was so disappointed and angry that he never again visited Hen. Their friendship had been lost and was replaced by fear and distrust. Fear and distrust. So this brings us to a knowledge area called Lesotho blanket. Because winters in Lesotho, the traditional home of the Lesotho people, is so cold and snow covers the mountains, the Lesotho blanket has become the national costume of its people and is still worn by many Lesotho today, particularly those living in rural communities in and around Lesotho. The colors and designs of these blankets change with fashion and may even vary between different age groups. A Lesotho man traditionally wears his blanket pinned across his right shoulder, while a Lesotho woman wears hers pinned across her breast. These brilliantly colored and beautifully patterned blankets may be decorated with a wide variety of different symbols and designs. So again, you just learned something about the Lesotho people from Lesotho in Africa. You learned something about their climate, right? You learned something about their tradition, right? The Lesotho blanket. You learn how men and women deal with the blanket, right? In your art class for kids, you can have them draw or knit or whatever it is kids do in art class, construction paper, whatever. You know, you can teach them. You can have them create their own Lesotho blanket, quote unquote. You can have them draw images of Lesotho people with their Lesotho blanket. You see? Like Achieve Mindset said about the previous story, the boy had an army, which is good for understanding discipline and preparation, right? That's your chance to teach folks about self-defense, about defensive strategy. So you see, these stories are not just some mindless story. And I'm almost tempted to go further, but I won't. But this is what we want, and I'm asking again, in the chat room, there is the link to join the Discord. Reverse, are you still here with us, or are you sleeping? Reverse, if you're here, did you click the link and join the Discord? Achieve Mindset, are you on the Discord? Achieve Mindset is in the room, and he says, the children can design a jacket in art. Yes, design, right, you could, right, forget the blanket, you could design a fly jacket. You know, you can design a fly jacket in honor of what the Lesotho people design. So again, you know, this podcast is focused on African-centered curriculum, and I'd like you guys to be focused on African-centered curriculum as well. Achieve Mindset is in the Discord. Achieve, hit me a message in the Discord just to remind me who you are. I don't know if you're the coding person in the Discord, but in the Discord, hit me a message, let me know who you are, because I realized today that someone on the Discord is someone who I know well and didn't realize it was them. Shout out to D-Web from the Harsh Reality Podcast. Make sure you guys tune in to the Harsh Reality Podcast. I didn't realize that was D-Web under that name. So it's cool for me to know who you are, you know, in the Discord. But I hope you guys who were here live with me, and I hope you got, okay, so that's you, Achieve. Okay, Achieve, now I got it together, right? I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. Yeah, okay. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. And I hope you guys understand what Achieve Mindset and I were talking about in these stories, and how you can take these stories and expand. I mean, just off the story alone, You could expand that into other subject matter that again ties the child back to their original African tradition. It centers them. Right? Instead of learning about the American eagle, which we really don't give a damn about, go back and learn about the African eagle. Right? So again, Achieve Mindset is there already. Anyone else who's listening, click the link in the Discord within the next 24 hours. If you happen to catch this episode after the link has gone, contact me on social media. I'm on Twitter, I'm on Instagram, I'm on Facebook. Contact me and ask me, how can you get in to the Discord and that you want to be on the writing team. For those of you who like the podcast and just want to kind of hang out around other fans of the podcast, come to the Discord and say to me, hey, I want to be a podcast fan. And I'll give you the role of that. And you will be able to do a bunch of stuff in the Discord. You'll be able to help if you feel to. And you'll be able to see certain notifications. For example, Saturday night will be a movie night on the Discord. All right. Last time I showed the boy who harnessed the wind. The people who did attend liked it. I know Coding Dude was, Achieve Mindset was there, at least for a while. And people really liked it. I'm going to show another film this Saturday. So make sure you guys hit the subscribe button, click the bell to be notified when I'm on. And until next time, I'll see you guys. Peace be unto you guys. Goodwill and everything. And we'll talk soon.
Thanks for listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast with your host, Cocoon. If you like what you just heard, we hope you pass along our web address, bittermedicineblogs.com, to your friends and colleagues, and share our show to all your social media. Be sure to check out our archive section on our website for previous podcasts. This has been a KWAZ radio production. Join us next time for another session of the Bitter Medicine Podcast. Follow us on Facebook at Bitter Medicine Show, Twitter, Bitter Meds, Tumblr, Bitter Meds, Instagram, Bitter Medicine.